European leaders say intensive work will continue on a US-led plan to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict after a joint call with US President Donald Trump. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky faces growing pressure from the United States to swiftly accept Trump's peace plan that includes major territorial losses. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, thousands of people are on the move as fighting continues. CGTN's Evacuations reports from a refugee transit center in Pavlograd.
In Pavlograd, the conflict arrives without uniforms. Plastic bags, packed suitcases, and people who look like they haven't slept in days. This transit center is one of the first stops for civilians fleeing the Donetsk region. A brief pause to warm up, register, and figure out where to go next.
They're flying drones over people. It's terrifying. Every day you go to bed thinking, will it hit my window? Will I stay alive? It's intense. Every single day from morning to evening. You can hear Konstantinivka, and we're being shelled too.
And it's not just buses pulling up here. Some people arrive by ambulances too, making any other way out impossible.
Things are exploding. People are leaving. Buildings are destroyed. Homes are destroyed. 3 days ago, there was a strike at the market.
Here, the battle doesn't just show up on a map. It shows up on who can get out and who cannot. Staff at this center say the situation around Pokrovsk has tightened so much that evacuation runs have effectively stalled.
The situation is getting worse and is extremely critical. For several weeks now, there have been no evacuees coming from Pokrovsk itself because the security situation doesn't allow teams to enter the community, and there are essentially no people coming out from those settlements at all.
Volunteers are trying to process arrivals as quick as possible. But the most difficult part, they say, is the silence of the areas they can't reach. When teams can't get in, people can't get out. Then you're left hoping and waiting for any signs that civilians are still alive.
So while diplomacy plays out abroad, the story here is still written in motion. Families leaving the east, heading west, one bus at a time. Evacuations for CGTN, Pavlograd.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Sergiy Kudelia is a political science professor at Baylor University. Dmitry Babich is a journalist and Russian political analyst. Also with us is Ulrich Bruckner. He's the Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. And Professor Anton Fedyashin focuses on Russian and European history at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Anton, let's start right here in the studio. The efforts to resolve this conflict are intensifying, but President Trump has taken a very hard line with President Zelensky, as well as with European leaders. In fact, he said European leaders talk a lot, but can't produce anything. Now he wants a response from Zelensky in just a few days. He wants to do a deal by Christmas. Let's listen to what the president had to say.
Not easy with Russia, because Russia has the upper hand. And they always did. They're much bigger. They're much stronger in that sense. I give Ukraine I give the people of Ukraine and the military of Ukraine tremendous credit for the, bravery and for the fighting and all of that. But, at some point, size will win generally. Europe is not doing a good job in many ways. They're not doing a good job.
I want to ask
you
about
They talk too much, and they're not producing. We're talking about Ukraine. They talk, but they don't produce. And the war just keeps going on and on.
So, Anton, Christmas is 2 weeks away. Zelensky has ruled out any territorial concessions. So where do you think this is headed?
Well, let's break this down into a couple of categories. First of all, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on Trump's deadlines. We've gone through them before. There was a Thanksgiving deadline. Okay, so let's put that aside. The second issue here is that Ukraine is running out of time. So whether this deadline moves is broken and Trump sets another deadline, the problem for the Ukrainians is that they are running out of manpower and the Americans are pulling out financially. They will probably continue to sell weapons to NATO, but the Europeans don't have enough money to buy all the weapons the Ukrainians need, and even if they did, the Ukrainians don't have the manpower to actually use those weapons. Time is not on Ukraine's side. And then the third issue here is the question of Vladimir Zelensky. He is in a very difficult position. If he willingly cedes territory, he will probably biologically not survive that decision for terribly long, because he's already been threatened openly and publicly by right-wing radicals in Ukraine, who have already publicly stated that anyone who cedes territory is going to be punished by death. But he also cannot continue this war because the money and the weapons and the people are running out. So he is in the worst possible position, and I have a feeling that he is desperately trying to organize some kind of face-saving way to cut this Gordian knot, and that is why he was in Europe. And then there's the fourth issue, which is this business that Trump mentioned about the Europeans talking an enormous amount and not delivering. And here, the American president happens to be right, because for all of the support that comes verbally for Zelensky and all the bear hugs that we saw over the past couple of days during his visit to, by the way, Brussels, London, and then Italy, not much has come out in terms of actual material support, because the Europeans themselves are out of weapons and they don't have enough money to support Ukraine for the intensity of the war that's happening in the southeast.
Sergiy Kudelia, I mean, what are President Zelensky's options right now? I mean, Anton just laid them out there, and there are not many good options for him. The Europeans say continue the fight, but Zelensky's main supporter, his main sponsor, is the United States. He runs the risk of alienating President Trump and the United States, which also wants him to make some major territorial compromises on this.
Yes, exactly. And I have to say that the Europeans are not very credible when they say that Ukraine has to continue fighting, because they have not still decided the issue of the frozen funds of Russia, and whether or not they're going to provide sufficient loans for Ukraine to be able to continue the fighting. That has to be decided in the next 2 weeks. Europeans are also in a very difficult position, because if Belgium ultimately vetoes this decision to provide Ukraine a loan out of the Russian frozen funds, then the Europeans would have to be paying out of their own money. And that is something that they're not really willing to do, given the economic crisis that Germany, Britain, and France are facing right now. So from this standpoint, President Trump is absolutely right. There is a lot of talk, but there is very little action on the part of the Europeans. And Zelensky is indeed, as Anton said, in a very difficult position, both domestically and internationally. But we have to remember that the negotiations are not one-dimensional. They're not just focused on territories. They're focused on other aspects. And one of the key aspects is security guarantees. So if there is indeed a viable trade-off, and that Ukrainians would ultimately be provided with substantial, credible security guarantees in return for the withdrawal from parts of Donbass that are not occupied by Russia at the moment, and if Ukraine also gets certain economic guarantees for the reconstruction of the country, rebuilding of the country in the next many years, then I think that kind of a deal can ultimately be politically viable for Zelensky.
Dmitry Babich, there's pretty widespread consensus among analysts and commentators, even Ukrainian commentators, who concede that Russia does have the upper hand right now on the battlefield. President Putin has taken what some may consider a maximalist position. He's saying, look, the territory that Ukraine has to cede is a non-negotiable. That could be one thing. It could also be a negotiating tactic. How do you see it?
Is this a question to me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that basically it is clear that time is not on Mr. Zelensky's side. He is to blame himself for that. When he came to power, when he won the election in 2019, he promised peace. And let me remind you that the first months of his administration were marked by prison exchanges and some gestures of goodwill on both sides. Later, he got scared by the right-wing extremists, whom Anton rightly mentioned, and he chose the way of less risk for himself. He decided not to alienate the nationalists and instead play hardball with Russia. I'm quoting Professor John Mearsheimer, playing hardball with Russia. Unfortunately, President Biden and Europe encouraged Zelensky to do so. They obviously did not believe that Russia would retaliate. Russia retaliated in February 2022. This was a tragedy for both nations, but here we have the result. As a result of Russia's efforts, we see who doesn't want peace. Europeans do not want peace because obviously President Biden used, his personal connections, his people whom he trusted, he sent them to Moscow. This is a new way of diplomacy and a very effective one because instead of lecturing President Putin, Kushner and Witkoff concentrated on what diplomats should do, that is, trying to meet the expectations and the desires of both sides. What they suggest is obviously a compromise, and now Europe is trying to destroy that compromise. I think this is not very moral because obviously the world is interested in ending this conflict. And of course, Russia would not resort to armed force if several times Russia had not been provoked before that. I'm not even mentioning 8 years of bombings and war in Donbass, but let's remember the Maidan tragedy, when Europe, even more than the United States, supported the so-called peaceful demonstrations in Kiev, as a result of which 38 policemen were killed, hundreds of policemen were maimed, and the legally elected president had to flee the country. So this is, in a nutshell, what happened. And I don't think we could expect any other result, given the people that are ruling Europe right now.
Ulrich, Bruckner, as we've heard, European leaders are not in a position to bankroll this war, nor do they have the kind of diplomatic clout that the United States has with President Putin. But the main fear among European leaders, and it's been expressed by a number of them, is that President Trump will, as they put it, abandon Ukraine if he doesn't get his way. How valid is that fear?
Well, it is very valid. If you only read the 28 points, this is practically a wish list by Russia, and Trump seemed to be willing to throw Ukraine under the bus. And therefore, it's unacceptable for the Europeans, who are not in a position to tell Zelensky or the Ukrainians what they should do with their country. They have been strongly supporting Ukraine from the very first day of the Russian invasion, and they did much more financially than the Americans did over the whole course of the 4 years of the war. So not doing anything is a misunderstanding of what's happening, and it's creating alternative fact, to use the terminology of President Trump. And the fact that the European Union is not a state and it's not run by strongmen like in Russia or in the United States doesn't mean that the Europeans don't get their act together. Belgium has a fair point. If they take the whole risk of using the frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine, then it would be asymmetric, and therefore the next council will see a solution. The European economies are not in terrible conditions. We should rather look at what conditions happening in Russia and what is happening with the economy. So as much as Ukraine is under pressure on the battleground, the Russian economy is under pressure economically.
Anton, I'm wondering what the Europeans, together with Ukraine, are hoping to achieve. I mean, we have French President Emmanuel Macron. He says Ukraine is resisting the Russian onslaught. He talks of more weapons, more training for Ukrainian forces. Let's listen to President Macron.
I think we have a lot of cards in our hands. The financing and the furniture of equipment and training programs to Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine is resisting in this war, and the fact that the Russian economy is starting to suffer, especially after our latest sanctions and the US sanctions. And now I think the main issue is a convergence between our common positions, Europeans and Ukrainians, and the US to finalize these peace negotiations.
So President Macron is saying the fight should go on, not that he believes that Ukraine's going to conquer Russia, but that it might put Ukraine in a better negotiating position.
I have to let me be diplomatic on it. I have no idea what President Macron is talking about, and I'm glad you showed the shot that you just did, because I hope the viewers noticed the face of President Zelensky as Macron was speaking, because Zelensky, throughout that photo op where everyone's speaking, his face tells a whole story. He looks tired, of course, under pressure, but also miserable and quite incredulous. I'm not sure where President Macron gets his information about the Russian economy. It's certainly under an enormous amount of strain. But if you look at the IMF figures for the past 2 full years, 23-24, Russia had the fastest growing economy in Europe. It's bound to slow down. It's bound to come under pressure. But Russia's not deindustrializing the way that Germany is currently, and Germany has been traditionally the engine of Europe. What we hear from Macron are empty words with absolutely no substance behind them. No amount of training is going to help a Ukrainian army whose desertion rate is the size or the sum of the British, German, and French armies that could be fielded today combined. And those are just the people who are fleeing the battlefields. So this is all rhetoric, and all of this sounds to me like a Hail Mary attempt to just wait things out and wait for a miracle to happen. Yeah. And as a historian, I have to tell you, I don't know of a single war that has been won on the basis of a miracle.
Sergiy Kudelia, on the question of elections, which is something that's now being talked about, elections in 60 to 90 days, President Zelensky says, of course, that could happen if the elections are protected, as he puts it. I mean, is that realistic?
It is getting more realistic, because we are hearing a lot of demands from the American side that Ukraine should be holding elections, at least presidential elections. So there is an international pressure on Ukraine to do that. And also internally, Zelensky has been weakened. His legitimacy has been weakened substantially because of the corruption allegations and the scandal that has been unraveling over the last several weeks, and that led to the firing of his closest associate, Andriy Yermak. And this weak legitimacy of Zelensky presents a problem for Ukraine, because he is a key leader of the Ukrainian state. He represents the Ukraine. And if there are questions about the level of support that he has from the Ukrainian society, is it possible to imagine Zelensky signing any deals or agreements with other powers? So I think it is in his domestic interest. Of course, he will try to make sure that these elections are held quickly. If he decides to go along with these elections, to make sure that there is not a long campaign. That is both for security reasons and for political reasons. And I think we have sufficient tools at our disposal, including technological tools, to be able to collect votes, even from those Ukrainians who are not residing in Ukraine at the moment, and that is millions of Ukrainians who live in Europe. So I think the discussion about elections is getting more realistic every week, and I think it's likely to happen over the next 6 months.
Dmitry Babich, there is a belief among some European leaders, and we hear it very often right now, that President Putin doesn't want to stop at Ukraine, that he wants to conquer some of the other European states as well. In fact, we heard the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz say on Monday that President Putin wants to bring back, quote, the old Soviet Union, and that Europe has to defend itself against what he thinks is a Russian plan to attack NATO. And for his part, President Putin said if there is a war between Russia and Europe, well, Russia will win that very quickly. What do you make of this rhetoric?
Well, I would quote Putin more precisely. He said, we don't want a war with Europe. We are not planning a war with Europe. We have it, as I quote, as I remember, he said, we don't have it in our minds, a war with Europe. But if Europe attacks, we're ready to fight. That was the answer from him. I think that this is the same story of demonizing Russia, which we have been seeing for many decades now. Let me remind you, when Gorbachev came to power, and made his first peaceful moves, Chancellor Kohl compared him to Goebbels. And, most of the Western politicians said it was just rhetoric to hide hideous plans to invade Europe and to establish Soviet dominance. Now we understand that this was all laughable. Gorbachev indeed meant peace. So the same story continues now. If Putin wanted to invade Europe, why would he organize and pay for the Olympic Games in 2014, right before President Yanukovych was ousted, illegally from power in Ukraine? It was Europe who took the initiative to destabilize the situation. If Putin had his way, no coup would happen in Ukraine. Ukraine would develop peacefully. Probably Yanukovych would lose the next election, but Ukraine would retain democracy, which it doesn't have now, at least until the next election. I would say that the problem is deeper. For many years, we saw two variants of dealing with Russia, in the West and in the East. In the East, there was the Japanese attitude, no concessions to Russia, and the Chinese attitude, let's discuss with Russia, let's be friends with Russia. As a result, Japan didn't get anything, and China got a lot of territory. And now we have a stable border with China. In the same way, in the West, there was Reagan's attitude, there was the hawkish attitude, and there was the attitude of a former German Chancellor, late Willy Brandt, who pledged to change the communist world by getting closer to it, by negotiating with it. The whole tragedy is that the West explained Russia's turn to peace and Gorbachev reforms by pressure, not by the humane steps from people like Willy Brandt and others.
Okay, let me get
from the hawks.
All right, let me get
this was simply not true. I was already a journalist at that time, and I remember it was not true. In the same way now, they continue to demonize Russia instead of seeking peace. We have seen it so many times.
All right, let me get to, okay, Dmitry, let me get to Ulrich Bruckner. We are rapidly running out of time. Ulrich, the United States administration, the Trump administration, recently published its national security strategy. And I'm wondering how this strategy fits in with Trump's approach to resolving this conflict in Ukraine. I mean, the document stresses the need for Russian strategic stability, and it's also been described as a major wake-up call for Europe.
Well, it's not a major wake-up call for Europe because we got already a wake-up call in February when J.D. Vance came to the Munich Security Conference to lecture us that we are not worth being defended. And I guess this opens the door to find a compromise in peace talks, because it's pointless for Ukraine to join NATO because NATO doesn't exist as a collective security architecture, and there's no automatic mechanism to defend an attack on one of us as an attack on all of us. So NATO exists in what Macron once called brain dead. It's an organization, but we don't know really what it's for. So in that sense, it matches what we just discussed. And it also matches what Putin is interested in. Because if the leader of the largest territory in the world occupies a neighboring territory, and by the way, is not capable to achieve any of his goals that he formulated at the beginning of the invasion, then it can't be such a powerful global power, and it is basically what Obama called a regional power. But it overlaps in its interest that Trump wants to make deals, and he expects a reintegration of Russia into the global economy as beneficial for the Trump family and its interests. And Putin is on a mission because he wants to rewrite history and change the order in Europe, because there is an organization that creates a supranational form of decision-making. And as we heard from the security strategy of Trump, the world would be better off if we have only nations who make America great and make Russia great, and all the nationalist rhetoric could then happily live together.
All right, Anton, what are your thoughts on that national security strategy? Because it goes beyond resolving just this conflict. I mean, it's really it's the way Trump sees the world. It's a blueprint for a new global order, a new global stability, I should
Well,
say.
it's a blueprint for Trump's new world order, but he has about 2.5 more years to implement it. Look, national security strategies come and go.
Yeah.
They can be reinvented every year by the same administration. Not to say, of course, that they change with the change of the administration. This really is a profoundly different document because it moves away from the whole Yalta system that our world inherited from about 70 years ago. But having said that, look, this is a document that outlines Trump's vision. No one should be surprised by it because he publicly stated it on multiple occasions during the presidential campaign, both the recent one and the one in 2016. This will come and go. The question is what effect it will have on the world in the next 2.5 years. And I think it's going to reinforce the regionalization of economic relations between the countries. Organizations such as BRICS and ASEAN and others will draw an enormous amount of inspiration from this and start going their own way and not depend on the United States and the West to the degree that they have for the past 80 years.
Sergiy Kudelia, I've just got less than a minute left, actually. So what are the best, what's the best case scenario for President Zelensky right now?
Well, the best case scenario for Zelensky is if he finds a possibility to get guarantees, security guarantees from the West and substantial economic funding for Ukraine's reconstruction, and territorial concessions that he has to make are not too painful. In other words, he does not transfer sovereign control over rest of Donbass to Russia, but he creates some kind of a demilitarized zone, which will be outside of direct control of Russia and Ukraine, maybe will be under international control. These are the general parameters that Ukraine has been advocating for. And if that's something that Russia will be willing to accept, the ceasefire is the first acceptable step.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.